Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of our DBT Bootcamp. So quickly, to revise what we did in episode 2, we looked at how to do DBT installation, setup. We basically went through all the details that we need to understand to set it up successfully on our local machine. So during that episode, we basically looked at how we would be installing our Git, which we'll use to do source controlling. We set up our GCP projects, Google Cloud Project, BigQuery. We looked at installing VS Code as our local IDE. We also looked at setting up the DBT itself. We set up the DBT locally. We also tested all the connection and everything is working fine. So that's what we did in our previous episode. In this video, we are going to take next step by actually understanding DBT folder structure first of all. So what we'll do is we'll very quickly go through all the folder structure that we have within DBT to really understand what each of those folders are supposed to do and why we should care about. Once we have that basic understanding of folders and also the files within them, and you might remember from our previous episode, there are two files which is really critical, dbt-project.yml and profiles.yml. We'll have a look at that and try to get a good understanding of what those two files do. Once we do that, we'll move on to our DBT project and we'll try to run our first DBT model. We'll keep things very simple, so if you're doing this for the very first time, it's really easy for you to follow. Once we get the first DBT model up and running, we'll kind of take a back seat, really try to understand what happened behind the scene, and when we run the model, what do we get out of the model? So we'll look at all of that, build that basic foundation of why things are happening. Then we can move on to actual modeling of the rest of the DBT models. So it's really exciting stuff. So let's dive right in. All right, so let's start. This is where we paused last time in our episode 2. And this is where we tested all of our DBT project is working by typing in dbt debug. Let's try that again. Of course, we need to activate our environment first. So let's do that. Let's see where that is. It's in our base folder here. So we'll just do source bin activate. It's now activated. We can do dbt debug. Actually, I'm just going to cancel right away because this is going to fail. And if you remember, I'm not in the right folder. So if you want to cancel something, and if you're first time using terminal, it's Control-C, and that will cancel your terminal outputs, whatever is running. So you might have to wait for a bit to cancel, but that's how it works. We need to go to actual transformation folder and then do dbt debug. Let's give it some time. So just making sure before we continue with the next step, my local environment is set up. You should also test the same, just to make sure everything is in the working order. And we are looking good here. It's all green, so happy days. And we can now move forward. And if you have been following the end-to-end the previous DBT Bootcamp videos, you would have both of these opened, right? And this is fairly straightforward to find. It's under transformation folder. You'll find the DBT projects. And then you have the profiles.yml, which is under your profile name. And then there should be a folder called .dbt, which is hidden. So you'll need to make sure that you're kind of opening the file properly, unhide the folder names, etc., to be able to open this file. But if you followed my previous video, I showed you how you can open this within the terminal using the code. So just follow that through. Okay, so we have these two files, but it's also important for us to not just understand these two files, right? As I explained previously, we really need to understand this whole thing. All the basic folders in here within the transformation folder, and that will basically give us this understanding of why these folders exist and how they're important and part of our DBT, kind of the whole framework. So the best way to do that is basically to share a quick slider here, really, to help you understand why these folders exist. Let's look at the screen here very quickly. And again, I've taken some of the slides out of my dbt Masterclass course because I think it's quite relevant to kind of bring them over here to share that with you. So here you can see I have basically organized them into two distinct areas. One is the dbt directory folders, which is what you see here. And then you have the configuration specific sort of documents, right? And that's basically the gitignore, the dbt project YAML, README, etc., which is what you see. So dbt directory folders and then the files. And I have specifically not mentioned the profiles.yml here in this slide deck. And that's because the profiles.yml typically, they don't sit inside the dbt folder, right? But I will still explain the details about the profiles.yml, but just be aware. Now, I might have mentioned this in the previous video, right? The profiles.yml file doesn't necessarily have to be under .dbt. You can certainly put this inside the transformation folder, but when you go and now do the dbt run, you'll need to make sure that you're giving the path of the profiles.yml. If you don't do that, that will fail. It's a bit of an advanced topic, so I don't want to kind of confuse you with this whole topic about it, but if you're just curious why we can't bring in profiles.yml under transformation folder, we can certainly do that. Not a problem. For now, that's not our focus. Let's go back to this. So we have a couple of folders. Let me just very quickly go through them. We have a folder called analysis, and you can see here, so you can relate it to. Currently, we don't have anything because we haven't created much in here. Analysis folder, as it suggests, is basically for ad hoc analysis and SQL queries. So think about it this way, right? So if we're doing a typical data warehouse model development, most of the time we have a specific, maybe a business use case that we're trying to achieve to, and we're building the data model to fulfill those requirements for the business, right? So you would do the data transformation, you would build different layers of data warehouse model, and then you would build your typical, well, dim and fact tables or mart layers, etc. Now you would, throughout that process, you would still need to do some form of ad hoc analysis or write like a one-off SQL queries that doesn't really fit in within your sort of data model. If you have those specific requirements, dbt basically allow you to put it under analysis folder. So once you have those files under analysis, they won't get kind of materialized into your data warehouse model when you do dbt run, because these are for analysis purpose. So you have to specifically pull those analysis back to your transformation model when you're happy with your analysis, right? So basically, to simplify, if you have any one-off SQL queries, you're doing some initial kind of understanding of how to write SQL, etc., you can put them in an analysis file and then bring them back to your dbt models later on if that's a requirement. The next one here, we have macros. Now the macros folder here is an interesting one, especially if you're coming to the dbt world for the very first time. You might be thinking like, what is this folder for? And I can very quickly show you here. We have the macros folder, right? And the macro folders is very similar to people who are familiar with programming languages. It's similar to functions, right? So you write it once and it's reusable across your code base. Same concept applies here for macros folder. This is the one of the really powerful features that dbt brings in. The ability to write the SQL once and being able to reuse this SQL snippets of files across your other data models. So you're now no longer polluting your SQL models by writing hundreds of logics and complicated stuff. You write it once. Macros also allow you to do things like defining logics within them. So you would do all of that within your macros, and you can kind of call those macros within your SQL models, and then it becomes reusable. It's really powerful, and we'll look at some of these later down the line. And what it does is it uses something called Jinja, and Jinja is the macro sort of the language that we can use to make sure that our macros are sort of reusable, right? And Jinja is very popular in Python language. So a lot of kind of templating language that we use in Python, that's been kind of carried forward because we're using this Jinja macro engine behind the scene. So enough about macros. Next one is the models. Let's go back to dbt. We have the models here. This is what you get when you do project dbt init for the very first time, which is what we did. And if you have not touched anything since then, you should see exactly the same thing here, right? And you can see very simply here, you have the initial sort of simple dbt models and with some sort of configuration here in the dbt model. And the model basically is self-explanatory. This is where your core dbt transformation models will sit in. This is where you would create various data warehouse layers. If you remember the data warehouse architecture, which I think we mentioned during, I think, video 1 or 2, I showed you how dbt fits in within your data warehouse models, within your staging warehouse, then your analytics layer, and then the BI consumption layer. This is where you would do those data modeling within the models folder. Then we have seeds. Let me go back. And seed folder is here. We don't have anything, of course. And to help you understand what seeds do, it's a really powerful thing, but we should also be very much aware and careful of how and when we should be using these seed files. Simply put, like seed files allow you to use your existing CSV files to load it into your data model. So imagine this scenario, you have, I guess, maybe it's the postcodes files that you have somewhere that you've downloaded, and you don't want to kind of go and build your data ingestion pipeline to continuously pull those postcode information because it's one-off, the postcode doesn't changes. What you have instead is a CSV file, right? And you just want to basically do this like a one-off load of those CSV files into your raw layer within your data warehouse. What you would do is you'd put that CSV file into the seed folder, and then you would run your dbt model, make sure it's kind of, pulling correctly from the seed files into your data warehouse models, and that would basically get materialized if you want to within your data warehouse tables. Now, the important things to understand here is these CSV files, sometimes I've seen it, they are huge, right? Really large file size. By putting the CSV files, so many of those CSV files within the seed folder, you're causing two problems, I would say. The first is your repository is now suddenly huge, right? So your typical data warehouse DBT models are not that large because it's just a bunch of SQL files, and those file sizes are not large. But now once you add the CSV files within your DBT model, let's imagine, I don't know, like one of your CSV files is like 50 megabyte, you got like 5 or 6 of them, suddenly it's like 200 megabyte plus your repository is. Every single time someone pulls changes or try to clone the repository, the time it will take will just increase. The more you put into the seed, the more the time would take. It's just not the best way to kind of, structure your repository. If you want to kind of experiment this short term, that's fine. But typically the best way to handle those situations would be to kind of see how you can fit those into your ingestion pipeline. Now, another area would be, because this is now kind of controlled within your data warehouse, any changes to the CSV file, you're going to have to continuously monitor that, continuously update it. And if the CSV files are frequently being updated, then this is another headache for you to maintain. So just be aware of it and see how you can think the best scenario would be for your business and for your use case if you have the requirement to use the CSV files in your seed, as a seed within DBT models. Now, snapshots. Snapshot, I would assume that we won't have anything here as well because we haven't built it. The snapshot folder is basically for people who are familiar with the data warehouse modeling. This basically gives you the sort of a SCD2, type 2, the historical capture. So what SCD means is the slowly changing dimensions. Whenever you work with the data, you have certain dimensions, such as customer is like super simple example. The customer information doesn't stay static, right? So you can think of yourself as a customer. You could have a situation where maybe your phone number changes, you move addresses, maybe the surname changes, the family name changes. And these are the things that you need to continuously monitor, continuously update. So if you have the upstream system where you have the database system, where you're capturing all this user customer information, which are changing, continuously changing, you need to make sure that your data warehouse is able to handle those changes in a most efficient and scalable manner without losing the historical results, right? Because sometimes you might want to go and do analysis of like the changing of the address if you're a company who is doing some form of marketing. Maybe, you might want to change your the marketing like newsletters, or your if you're sending physical items in a form of marketing material, you don't want to send it to the wrong address, for example, right? So being able to track historical data changes is super, super important. And dbt comes with a pre-built feature called snapshots, which is by default is a type 2, SCD type 2. And I'm not going to go into super detail because it's a really, really in-depth topic on how you would maintain these like a changing data capture. But for now, just be aware that snapshots will enable you to handle the historical data capture fairly quickly and easily, because you don't have to go and do lots and lots of kind of configuration to handle this. And it's for anywhere from, I would say, from simple to medium complexity work cases, use cases. I've seen like snapshot handling it pretty well. So yeah, just be mindful of that and aware of it. Next, we have test. Test, let's go back. Let's have a look. Test also here is empty, right? Now, test basically enable you to do test. Surprise, surprise. But yeah, people who are maybe coming from more of a traditional sort of stack and data warehouse solutions, you might not be like familiar with how you would be writing test, right? But if you're coming from like a Microsoft background, etc., yes, they do it like very, very well over there. But if you're just been building like simple data warehouses, like testing might sound as like an alien language to you. But the testing is super, super important. If you're building a scalable data warehouse, enterprise data warehouse systems, without having a strong testing in your solution, you're most likely to build a data warehouse which is maybe just going to break and give you a wrong information, right? So testing is super important. There are a variety of different ways you could write test, but test folder is where you would store your custom data test. And we'll come to that later down the line, because test is super important. And dbt provides you with lots of options like out of the box simple test, such as like not null, unique test, things like that, all the way to being able to write your own custom data tests as well. So it's really cool. Next, we have the target folder. Now, target folder here, if you look at this, it's not available here. You can't see it. And that's because we've never run our dbt models just yet, right? So the target model appears once you've actually ran your first dbt model, you've compiled your dbt model, the target folder will appear. What target folder allow you to do is to look at all of your raw SQL, but in a compiled manner. So let me just give you a very quick understanding of what I'm saying. If you look at this SQL model, which was here inside our models folder, right? We have these things. These are the Jinja templates and configuration settings that we've been kind of touching briefly. Like, look at this here, right? It's basically, typically, if you're writing SQL query, you would just say select star from this table and where ID equal 1. But in dbt, the things work slightly differently. Instead of saying, giving the full table name, you call them as a reference models, right? So what this is doing here is it's referencing the first dbt model, which is this model. So when we run the model, it will materialize this content within the SQL file as a table in our data warehouse. Then we'll have that data warehouse table name available, which would be my first dbt model. I'm assuming, unless the name has been changed somewhere. But then the second model, which is what you see here on the screen, would basically pull that here dynamically, right? The dbt engine will do that for you via the Jinja templating. Now, when we do the dbt run job, you would see this compiled inside the target folder. So you could see suddenly this is how this is going to be super helpful for us. First of all, for debugging purposes, this is amazing because like what the SQL file you saw previously is like a super simple SQL, right? But in a real world scenario, we are not going to be writing really simple SQL. Most of the time is complicated. We might have multiple CTEs. We might be doing complicated data transformation logic within that. And the best way to do that is to compile your SQL files, then read through the compiled SQL files and really understand what that is doing. You could even copy paste that compiled SQL file into your data warehouse console areas and go run them manually and really understand what the output is going to be. If there are any bugs, you do that kind of back and forth, debugging and updating your logic, whatever that might be. So target folder is really important. It's not there yet, but it is super important. Now we've kind of covered all the dbt specific directory folders. Let's move on to the configuration and the documentation files. Now here in the configuration and documentations file, we have 3. And as a reminder, I will touch base on the profiles.yml. We have dbt-project.yml. We have README.md. And then we have the gitignore. Let's start with the easiest one. Yeah, nice. The gitignore. So we created the GitHub repository previously, right? And then this is our remote repository, and this is our local repository. Now, I haven't touched on the subject of kind of Git kind of initialization our repository as a Git source control folder, and then being able to kind of push those changes to our remote repository here, which is what we will be doing once we've successfully run this dbt model. But what this gitignore allow us to do is to define the files and folders that we want to ignore, right? Why do we want to do that? Because as the project grows and you get more and more things in your dbt models, you would want to ignore certain files and folders because either they are useless to be put as a source controlled because it's just going to be polluting, confusing people, or they're just like specific to your system. Now the target here is a really good and easy example to explain. If you remember, I explained target, what it does just a few minutes ago, right? The target folder, the things that you'll see here in this is very specific to your environment. Think of it like 2 developers working on the same project, right? You would have your own features that you would be developing as your core dbt model. For example, one developer might be working on customer table. Another developer might be working on orders table, like really simple example. Now, if you now go and build the SQL models, do compile SQL, in the target folder, you're gonna have very specific SQL files for you only. It doesn't make sense for us to source control this every single time we push our changes to the Git repository, that thing to be appearing here, and then it will continuously overwrite the code of one or the other, right? Because you would push your changes with the customer information in here, customer table information in here. The other person would push the changes with orders, for example, SQL information in here, and you'll just have like too many things going on in the folder. It's really not providing any value really. So what we would do is come to the gitignore file, put target as as a folder that we want to ignore. Same thing with dbt packages. Like we don't really need to source control at this point these specific packages because they're all sort of defined within the specific configuration files on, what packages do we need, what do we want to do, the versions, etc. That's all sort of within here. So whoever is a developer, as long as they have the latest version of configuration, they can recreate this in a very simple way. And packages eat space as well, right? So you don't want to sort of source control all of this. And logs, again, is simple. Why would you want to source control logs? Because they usually contain lots and lots of information, which are not really useful. Like if you look at this here, right? It has like my information about my folders and what I've been doing, all these things. Like, it doesn't make sense for us to source control. So yeah, I just wanted to pause very quickly and help you understand what is a gitignore, why we would want to ignore certain files and folder, because it's super, super important, right? To understand these basic concepts. So next, dbt project README. Before I go to the dbt project, let me do the easier one. README is simple to explain. README basically will help you or any other developer understand what is happening within your project and what this project is about, how you would set up dbt, how would you run dbt. There are very specific ways to do it. And these days, I would even recommend you to just use a generative AI to generate some of these README information, because they can do it way more nicer and well formatted, structured, and then you can use that as a template and continue to enrich your information here. Just be aware the folder extension here is MD. What that means is it's in a markdown format, right? So README is written using a markdown format. So that's another thing that you'll need to really sit down and understand if it's first time looking into this, because look at this. You have different extensions here of the file format. So you got the .sql file, which we are familiar with. Then you have the .yaml, and it's important for you to go and read a bit more about why specific extension and why they are used, right? But for now, this is what you do for README. This is why we would need a README, and it is written in a markdown. And if we open the preview, if you write it in a markdown, and when it goes to your repository here, you would see it in this fashion, right? Because the markdown language enables that nice format that you see here. So just be aware of that. Next is dbt-project.yml. Now, dbt-project.yml contains the project level specific configuration. This is where you would define where your models folders are, analysis folders are, etc. Because we are in the parent directory, we don't really need to do anything because dbt has done it for you. Unless you have a specific requirement, please go ahead and do it. You have specific things like version, the profile, which is the profile that we set, if you remember, during our dbt initiation. And we got a few other things in here. I'll explain this in a bit more detail just in a moment. So this is what the dbt-project.yml contains, project-specific information. I would recommend you to go and read more about these things by yourself, because again, it's great you're watching my videos. It's great you're interested in learning more about dbt, but nothing is better than going and reading these by yourself and really understanding it and using my videos as a guideline to help you guide. And then continue to enrich your information. There are many other things now, you can use again, generative AI, ChatGPT, Claude, whatever is your favorite. Go and use those tools to really understand these in a much more granular detail. This is what makes you a really good developer compared to other people who would just be scratching the surface. We don't want to do that. Really want to understand the details. Anyway. And then I'll quickly cover the profiles here, which is, we've touched on before, but this contains your data warehouse, sort of project level specific information, the type of your database. And if I go to my next slide, I've got this really nice document, which helps you understand step by step what is happening. Again, I brought this from my dbt Masterclass because I think it will be really beneficial for anybody who's watching my bootcamp. So you can see here, So step by step, we have on the top, the first row, right? We got the project name in a snake case. This is the project name, and this is maybe slightly different to what we have because I have used it from my DBT Masterclass. So bear with me. The things here look slightly different, but the concept here is, the same. So the output basically contains or will define the specific connection information for the data warehouse of our choice. Then we will set the label of our connection detail. We have the dev here, right? And you see here, I'm just going to skip very quickly. We have the target defined here as dev. I'll pause very quickly and help you understand what is happening here. So we have the connection, the detail name here defined as dev. If you're just like developing locally, sure, happy days. Nothing, like crazy is happening here. It's simple days, I guess, and you're just running your models. It's all good and great. Now, in a real life scenario, it doesn't really work like that, right? Because in a real life scenario, you're going to be working with multiple environments. Imagine your business. Let's go back to the customer example that we used previously, right? So if you have customer information, do you really want to store all that customer sensitive information in detail in your dev environment? Most likely no. Your company or your security team is going to be like, that's a violation against our security policies. You cannot do that. There is typically a separation of layers at the project level in a large organizations or any organization, I guess, which is handling data adhering to kind of GDPR, different other kind of policies. So you typically end up with like development server or development area. Then you would have a test or pre-prod area, and then you have a production environment. Now, as a developer, as a DBT developer, you would also need to accommodate those certain scenarios. So for the development environment, you might have these specific configurations. If you remember, I believe in my second video, I talked about how the differences between OAuth and service account keys and service account impersonation methods. This is where it all comes together, right? So in a production environment, they might need to run using service account keys with a really tight security credentials. So your configuration might be very different for production. What you can do is now copy paste the whole section. Instead of calling dev, you could call it prod, pre-prod, test, whatever, and then dynamically control the target dev. The idea here might be slightly advanced for people who are just coming to this journey, but bear with me. It's really important that you get to hear these thoughts and concepts and ideas as early as possible. So you know how things works. So your brain is already kind of bought into the idea and slowly when you're designing the DBT models, you're already maybe unconsciously thinking about best practices, and you can come back, when you're in those sort of like certain scenarios and situation. Anyway, that's enough. Let's move on. Then we define our data sets. In this specific thing, we're calling it analytics. If you remember in previous one, we said it's going to be Stack Overflow because we will attempt to build the data model for this Stack Overflow public data set from BigQuery. Now, for my DBT Masterclass, I'm using this analytics data set for now. Then we would define the maximum timeout. So if your DBT model is running for a really, really long time, we want to define that kind of seconds. It will just get killed automatically because we don't want to have like hugely like long running jobs for no other reason, right? So if the job fails for this certain period of time, we can go and do a debugging if needed to be, or if we need to increase the time because the data model is taking longer to execute, something for us to look into. Maybe if your model is taking so long, there might be optimization conversations we need to have. Job retries, number of retries in case of failure, pretty straightforward. Location of the data set, we've covered this in our video episode 2. The authentication type, we just spoke earlier. The priority level of job, it is interactive. Then we have the project, the name of the BigQuery. Again, this example is from my Masterclass, and the project for Masterclass is the dbt Masterclass. But for the Bootcamp, I believe we named it differently, and the project ID is different to what you're seeing here. Next, we have the number of threads used when executing the dbt project. Now, let me explain this very quickly. So if you're running dbt job, you can define how many of those jobs you would be able to run in parallel. Like for the, I guess, local development purpose, I've seen anywhere from 1 to 4 to 8 satisfies most of the requirements. You don't have to go too crazy with the numbers. But I would say keep it to 1 for now, run it, see how it works. If it doesn't work, just improve it by the incremental numbers to maybe just 4. See if it improves. If not, then maybe there are other issues that you need to look into, like your model is not performant or something like that. Type of data warehouse, pretty self-explanatory. And then target, we've explained which target that we would be using. If you have multiple targets, you might want to handle this dynamically, right? So that's what it is for profiles.yml. Next, let's have a look at the dbt project.yml. In the same fashion, we have the project name in the snake case. Then we would have the version of the project immediately followed after. Now, I will go back to our version here. It's slightly different, right? Because you can see here we got some comments and things in here. What I have done is, again, I've taken this out, these comments, just to give it a bit more clear part for you to help understand what are the other configurations you can also see, because I've got the additional ones here as well. It's not exactly the same as our Bootcamp, but what is important here is the concepts and understanding of each of the configurations here. The profile dbt used to connect the data platform, right? So the profile here is called transformation, and that should be the same as your profiles.yml profile, right? If it is different, this is going to fail. So you make sure your profile is defined correctly inside your dbt project. Next, I think we've explained previously, these are like directories of your dbt, which are all of these, and you're just defining in the configuration where they are. You don't have to do too much because, by default, dbt does it for you. Then you're defining where you want your targets to be in. Currently, it is going to be in the target folder. Next, we have clean targets. So in dbt, what you can do is run a command called dbt-clean, and dbt-clean basically goes and does some cleaning behind the scenes, like deleting logs and cleaning specific things that you have defined under here. So currently we have targets, dbt packages, and logs that we have defined. And dbt-clean command is really powerful because sometimes I've noticed, like if you're running fairly complicated dbt models, or if you've done like a reset of your dbt project, sometimes things can go a bit weird. So dbt-clean sort of help like reset those cache things. So just, try it out if you encounter any issues, and it most of the time solves quite a few issues. And anything that you're gonna get cleaned here, by the way, is not gonna have a major impact anyway, because everything in the target folder, you can just recreate it by either running dbt compile or dbt run. Dbt packages, again, you can just reinstall dbt packages, logs, same scenario. Now, here is quite important things here. This configuration here, require dbt version. Currently, we're defining, at least in this example, right? We are setting our dbt version to be anywhere between these two, version 1 and version 2, the major versions of the dbt. And this is quite critical because going back to the production situation that I was explaining earlier, right? So you have a dbt production environment. You want to make sure that there's not going to be like immediate breaking changes. So if you don't define this, someone might basically clone your dbt repository, just do dbt installation, all of that, and it will just install the latest version of your dbt. So having this configuration here would ensure that whatever dbt version that they have falls within this range. There ain't gonna be any sort of like unseen issues that we might not be able to catch because of the version upgrades. So if there are any major version upgrades required, that should kind of go through proper channels, testing backward compatibility, etc. Only then that should go into production. Next, this is where we define specific model configuration. Now, this is a really complicated topic to sort of explain in this particular video. So I'm going to kind of keep it fairly light, but if you're very curious about it, there is a dbt documentation that explains all the things about like model specific configuration. I'll recommend you to go and read about that. But for now, anything that you want to define at the model level, you can come in here and do it, right? So you can see here we have specific things that we've defined. What this means is we are persisting documentation for our models, and we are also saying for our dbt transformation models, the staging layer, we are enabling this layer as true. What that means is when we run the dbt model, this folder or the layer would be valid, right? It will be factored in as part of the dbt run, and the tables within this model, the staging model, would be materialized as a table, right? And the schema also should be called staging. So when it goes and gets materialized inside your data warehouse, the schema, this is specific to BigQuery, but your data set would be called staging, right? So this is it for the dbt YAML. I know it's not like super detailed, but I think it's detailed enough for you to really understand and grasp the concepts of each individual configuration and why they do certain things. And it's super important for us to understand. So to going back to our VS Code and to basically do a quick summary of what we've done so far. So we basically spend last couple of minutes looking into each of the folders, really understand what each of these folders do. We went through specific files within these folders around dbt project, README, profiles, and the gitignore is another one. And we briefly touched on Jinja templating. We looked at like how the dbt compilation would work. We understood the dbt target folder. And then what did we do? We then actually went into the details on the profiles.yml, went into details of the dbt project.yml, each of the configuration and why they do certain things and how they are two connected. So I hope this is helpful for you to really understand why dbt folders are important and how the configuration works. I know it's a bit like high level and it's covering some of the most important basic bits, but stay with me on this. Like I'm sure we'll cover like some of more like advanced topic as we continue to progress in our kind of dbt bootcamp journey. And then now let's wrap up here and move on to actually creating our first dbt model.